Diane, for being my co-host tonight. I really appreciate it. And I also wanted to start with a word of thanks to Carol Hayes and to Stephanie Mason for reaching out to me and asking me to participate in this wonderful series. I've really enjoyed all of the sessions that I've participated in, and I know that many of you have as well. It's keeping us going, our connection to the Audubon Naturalist Society during this time. So tonight I'm just delighted to have the chance to share with you some of what I've learned over a number of years about using a journal to observe more deeply, to explore mysteries, and to enhance our connection to nature, all while having a really good time in the process. So I am hoping that if you already journal, that you'll hear some new ideas and perhaps get some tips. And if you haven't started to journal yet, I really hope that this inspires you to get some paper and pencil and head out the door and explore the world beyond your windows. Well, the Audubon Naturalist Society has been a really big part of my life for almost 13 years. And I guess I can't say it any better than I did here on the homepage. Taking the classes in the field studies program and going on so many field trips, and also a couple of the trips that Carol organizes, has really instilled this passion in me for spending time outdoors and studying nature. And it's actually been a wonderful balance to my career as an art conservator, which generally keeps me indoors and attending to the human-made world. So I'll start with just a quick little anecdote. It was over 13 years ago when I found myself in Costa Rica, and I saw this amazing bird. And I did a very quick little pencil sketch with a couple of little color notes, and I showed it to our trip leader. And she said to me, "Oh, that's a blue-crowned motmot." Well, that's my spark bird, which you birders know about. And also it was the first time that I experienced the power of making a hand-recorded observation in nature. So I think that now these favorite words by author and activist and wise woman Terry Tempest Williams are particularly applicable. Of course, exotic nature is alluring, but as so many of you know, there is so much to enjoy and be enriched by right here in our own backyards, what I like to call near nature. And certainly in our current circumstances, when we really are staying home, this is particularly applicable. I really think that keeping a nature journal is just the best way for teaching ourselves and also for creating really meaningful moments that can soothe us and enrich us in this time when we really need it. So here is the world outside my windows, my so-called wild home, to quote our own Melanie Chukas Bradley, author, naturalist, and trip leader par excellence. And in Melanie's newest book, Connecting with Nature in a Time of Crisis, she reminds us with her characteristic eloquence of how enriching it can be to observe both constancy and change in nature. She writes, "Our wild homes teach us to honor the familiar and delight in the new." And this is exactly what I have found in these different parts of Rock Creek Park that I've been journaling in, and also the community garden where I'm lucky enough to have a vegetable plot. So it was really curiosity about my wild home, what's right across the street from me, that prompted me to start all of the classes in the Natural History Field Studies program. And this is actually my first field journal from our beloved Jane Huff's Introduction to Biology class. And while there is certainly some measure of perfectionism at play here in my carefully copied over notes in a lined notebook and copied over drawings, there are nonetheless some really good observations here. And more importantly, everything that I learned in Jane's class and all of the classes that I've taken in the Field Studies program prepared me to really hear the messages of a particularly impactful and effective teacher in nature journaling. And that's John Muir Laws, known as Jack. And Jack Laws is a wildlife biologist, educator, illustrator, and naturalist par excellence in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he founded the Bay Area Nature Journal Club, which now has become a worldwide online community in this era of COVID. In 2016, he published the book that you see here, which I view as my Bible for nature journaling and drawing. And he also recently came out, he co-authored a book called How to Teach Nature Journaling with Emily Lygren from the California Academy of Sciences. And this dynamic duo has produced just an amazing book, which all of you educators and homeschoolers and parents and anyone who wants to have a wonderful and well-organized presentation, I encourage you to get this book. Jack's website is packed with a variety of resources, many of which are free. Wonderful weekly online demonstrations, and I just can't recommend them enough. His teaching is so thoughtful and practical, and it's thoroughly imbued with this amazing spirit that he has, this spiritual connection to our planet. The two most important lessons, I think, that I learned from the workshops I did with Jack were, first of all, the existence of what's called the growth mindset. In other words, our brains can actually develop and change while we are practicing a skill. Abilities can be learned. That was news to me, and it was really good news, particularly when it comes to learning a new skill like drawing. And that was the second really important lesson. As tempting as it might be sometimes to view a nature journal as this series of pretty portraits of nature, what's really most important is the process of observing and of recording your observations. And that was a really important lesson. So I think starting with the why of nature journaling is important before we get to, the how and the what. And again, in general, I would say that why we create a nature journal is to externalize our thinking as we are out in nature. This is your brain on paper. And your journal, therefore, can be this really dynamic manifestation of what you're experiencing while you're outdoors. So the first 2 points here, of course, focusing our attention, observing deeply, starting to develop inquiry, all of this can help us identify the things that we're seeing outdoors, but it can also help us delve even more deeply into the stories behind all of these organisms and how they relate to their natural environment and to their ecological community. And I think we've all had personal experience of how writing something down really helps cement it in memory. That's why we keep our shopping lists. But writing something and drawing something in particular really cements things into memory. And making connections, starting to see patterns or to see a resonance between what you're observing in nature and what you already know. This is something that is very useful. And then once again at the bottom, I always add have fun. So a turning point in my nature journaling was one of the workshops I did. It's 2013, and I am in this absolutely amazing place in the Sierras, the Butterfly Valley Botanical Area. And this was a very wet and warm habitat that was absolutely packed with California pitcher plants. A pretty exotic species that we're lucky if we just see one or two of. And this was an absolutely amazing place. And so there I am observing it all and starting a sketchbook page. So I really was pretty much overwhelmed with the wonder of this place. And I made a watercolor, I made a portrait, but I admit I didn't get much farther at that point. Luckily, I went back 3 years later and was able to have another opportunity to develop my journal page. And I think if you compare them, you'll see that the later page is really more effective. I have a larger drawing, and while I didn't take the time to add color, I've got a basis for that later. But I've also included some measurements, some numbers, some questions. It's arguably a more dynamic page. And one thing just to notice, and you'll see this elsewhere in my journals, you might be able to just make out some very faint blue lines below my drawing. So that's going to be a hot tip that I'll give you a little bit later on. So then, what is this nature journal that we're making? Let's unpack that a little bit more. So I guess I could sum it up by saying that it's 3 general areas of content manifested in 3 different languages. The content is our observations, connections, and questions realized with words, pictures, and numbers. So why 3 different languages? Well, each of these helps us look at our subject in a different way, and it inspires different ways of thinking. Writing, of course, clarifies and specifies. Drawing, as I mentioned before, really cements things into memory and, of course, requires continual close observation. And numbers, quantifying, that's a completely separate language, and it can result in different information, and it can sometimes result in different patterns. Now, when we go outdoors, of course, our senses are overwhelmed. There's so much stimuli, and the blank page of the journal can sometimes be a bit daunting. So there are 3 prompts that you can use to launch you into your page. I notice, I wonder, and it reminds me of. And if you like short forms, you can shorten this to ini wormo. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So I notice these are observations made in the moment using our senses. This is what you're seeing. This is what you're touching. This is what you might be hearing, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that I suggest when you go outdoors, if you want to get those observational juices going, is to actually say out loud what you're noticing. This is an exercise I've done in these workshops. You can do it alone, or you can do it in a pair or with other people. If you see it, say it. And that starts to get things flowing. After we've made a number of observations, we're going to have questions. And recording those questions is the beginning of really delving deeply into your subject. Ideally, you will capture your curiosity in just a veritable cascade of questions. And I'll add that there's no question that's too simple. Sometimes the most obvious questions should still be asked and noted, because an even more interesting question could be right behind that basic question. So the more questions, the better. And then it reminds me of. And these are connections between what you're observing and your pre-existing knowledge or information. It could be something like the shape of something reminds you, or the behavior of a critter reminds you of something else. All of that is valuable to record. And I'm presenting this in something of a linear fashion, but as you progress with your journaling, it is fluid, so you can go back and forth between these prompts as much as you want. So post-workshop, this is a page that I did in Golden Gate Park, and I made every effort to try to use the prompts and the different languages. And I'll point out at first my little bird sketch up here in the top left corner. And even though it demonstrates very nicely one of the most common errors in drawing birds, that is the overly rounded head looks a little bit too much like There it is, a little bit too much like a snowman bird. But nonetheless, before the bird flew, I was able to get some color notes, a little bit about the structure and shape, and it was just enough to help me identify it later. Even more interesting were some of the things that I noticed about a scrub jay going to 3 different locations and hiding food. And lastly, there are a couple of shortcuts here. These rubbings that I did of plants in the park, in situ, gave me a lot of information pretty quickly and enabled me to keep going. Now, closer to home, I had the privilege of heading out to Theodore Roosevelt Island with Melanie Chukas Bradley to do a journaling session. And this happened while she was working on her upcoming book on Theodore Roosevelt Island, which I believe is due out in September. So I gave Melanie the challenge of finding a plant that she didn't recognize. And for those of you who know Melanie, that is no mean feat, but we actually did find a little plant that we did not recognize. And we ended up spending over 2 hours making images, noting our connections, taking some measurements. We got so very much into the flow of this journaling experience that I actually forgot to eat lunch. And for those of you who know me, that is unprecedented. Unfortunately, a postscript, that little plant, that little flower ended up being an exotic invasive plant. So we both learned something that day. One of the things that has been really interesting to me in my naturalist pursuit is how the seemingly indistinguishable masses of green can be resolved into actually specific species of plants. And this is a page that I did rather recently of 2 plants that seemed somewhat similar right across the street from me in my wild home, white avens and honewort. And I have been noticing all these different leaves of 3, leaflets actually. And I'll just point out a couple things about this page. And I know you'll be able to look a little more in the recording later if you choose to. And I found that it was really useful to use little pieces of graph paper in order to make rubbing of the rather complicated and fussy toothing along the edges of these leaves. So it not only picked up all those details because it was thinner than my sketch paper, but it also has a built-in scale. So that was something I hadn't done before that was kind of neat. And I also did prepare the format of this page a little bit before I went out in order to get all the information I wanted to. It is a pretty densely packed page, but hopefully it is still legible. Also, I wanted to point out that I've made a note to myself of some of the things that I'd like to study and compare to these. Of course, poison ivy, there's a lot of that nearby, goutweed, an invasive plant, and I'm also very curious about what box elder seedlings look like, because the leaves on the tree, certainly those leaflets appear to be leaves of 3 as well. So these will be some of my next pages, exploring all of the mysteries that are in my vegetable garden. I think that garden journaling is going to be a particularly dynamic way to explore what's going on in this environment that is partly under my control, but yet at the same time, very much not in my control.
So, materials and tools, of course, this could be a really huge topic for discussion, but I'll give just a few tips. And of course, many of you who, my slides back, great. So many of you who already do journaling, of course, have a lot of experience with tools and your favorite tools. But what I suggest, for those of you who haven't journaled outside or who haven't journaled at all, I recommend keeping it simple and keeping it near your door so that your materials and tools are always ready when you want to head on out and journal. I'll just point out a couple of the things here in this slide. So that big blue pencil that's looming up in the top right. That is a Prismacolor copy knot non-photo blue pencil, and this is a tool that was a real game changer for me, because with this tool you can make very light, loose lines on your drawing. You can use it for a preliminary drawing. Light, loose lines. It hardly even shows. It shows just enough for you to see it while you're working with it. And some of those lines are going to be clunkers, but some of those lines are going to be keepers, and you'll be able to go over those with pencil or with something else later. I also use a variety of different pencils. You can use mechanical pencils. You can use pencils that you have to sharpen yourself. But in general, I would advise sharp, but not too skinny. I'm always trying to get myself to work a little bit larger so as to avoid getting too fussy. And I'll make one comment about watercolor. Sorry, there, my slide keeps going in and out, but it's back now. So my advice is, if you're just starting in watercolor, is to keep it simple and just try to use a few different colors and take note of the pigments that are in those paints. So I'm showing you 3 different Winsor Newton colors, and I've written down the actual pigment numbers. And getting to know those pigments is going to really help your paint mixing be much more controllable. Finding a yellow, a magenta, and a cyan that mix to produce these beautiful, rich, and intense hues are really, really valuable. And you could add a couple of earth colors to that and move on. I'll also mention that little brush that you see there that has the pale blue handle, that is a water brush, and that's another real game changer. Having a reservoir of water right there in the handle of your brush is awesome. It's very, very handy. So next slide, please. So I can't tell, Diane, if I'm seeing the next slide or not.
Yeah, it's up there. It's exercise turning
Great.
over and over new leaf.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now, everyone, it's your turn. And I invite you to try journaling with an exercise that I like to call turning over and over a new leaf. So head outside and find a leaf that's new to you, or a leaf that you would just like to get to know a little bit better, and start your journal page. And I would advise that if the leaf is actually new to you, approach it with the goals of just seeing it and being with it, maybe before even worrying about IDing it. Next, please. So the next 2 slides, you will all get a copy of this. So the next 2 slides have a fair amount of information in them. I will go over them a little bit quickly to get to the end. But starting your page, you go out and you record what we call our metadata. That helps break the page and get something down there. Where are you? The date, the time, something about the weather. You could even add your watershed address if you want to. And that gets you started in your I notice. You're probably going to be drawn to something, and you're going to notice something. And I would suggest with your leaf that you get an image down on paper. If you like to sketch, go ahead and sketch. If you need a little help, use some of these other methods, which are not cheating. They're expeditious. You can do a tracing, you can do a rubbing, etc. And that really helps you get going. Unfortunately, I have just lost my slide again. However, if you continue in the vein that I described previously, with your written descriptions, adding the questions that you're experiencing and the connections, and adding something about quantifying. And I'll say that, for all of us, we're all different. And one language might be easier than the other for you. And I would proceed with whatever one you find easier. Great. Next slide, please. And it should say, and keep going.
Yep.
So there's so much more that you can do in your journal page. A title and the page layout and format are things that you can do in advance. You can do before, during, or after, whatever really works, whatever works for you and whatever makes sense. And you can add to, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, you can add, could it be? So these are possible answers or explanations for your observations. And it's perfectly fine, and in fact, it's desirable to traffic in the language of uncertainty. This is what science is all about, coming up with explanations, possible answers, and then maybe thinking about, well, how would I answer that question? Could I do some more observation? Do I need to look into a written resource? Is that something that has to be the subject of an experiment? All of this can get you a little bit more deeper. Doing a little habitat sketch or a mini landscape can add a lot of context to your page. And there are many other curiosity prompts. Each of these are discussed in Jack Law's drawing book, and I highly recommend that you all check that out. Next slide, Diane. And I wanted just to give a couple kind of final tips about drawing. The slide that hopefully you're seeing, I'm not seeing it at the moment, shows a very complex plant that I attempted to draw, and I had a little bit of a journal meltdown with it, and then I remembered one of Jack's great pieces of advice, which was if it's too many parts or it's complicated, make a diagram. And that can be a very useful way to get information down. So here I made a diagram, I did a tracing of a shadow, and I also did a rubbing. Another couple of other things about drawing is I think it's good to remember that this is field sketching, not scientific illustration. And what's most important is to put in what we call your pencil miles. Keep drawing. Remember that while you're drawing to learn about your subject, you are learning to draw. And I think if you approach it with this attitude, it takes away a lot of the fear of art with a capital A. Look at other people's journals. Beware of journal envy. You're going to have it. I have it all the time. But what I would do is approach it with a perspective of what can I steal and what can I use from this. Next slide. So I'm showing you a couple of books. I already mentioned Jack's book. The book on the far right by Claire Walker Leslie is a really good one. She's written many, many books about nature journaling over the decades. And the book in the center by Kathy Johnson is a particularly good one. I love what she does with pencil. And I would definitely recommend taking a look at her drawings. Find something that speaks to you and work with it. Next and last slide, please, Diane. So speaking of speaking, Mary Oliver always spoke to me, still speaks to me. And we always call her our patron saint of naturalists. And she could be giving us our suggestions in our nature journaling process. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. And apologies for the tech glitch, and thank you to Diane for the tech rescue. And if it's possible to take questions, I'd love to do it in whatever time we have left.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, could you unmute yourself and ask it? That way Kate would be able to hear you.
This is Anna. I was asking about how she did the rubbing with the graph paper and the leaf.
Yes, very simple. That was actually a brown Prismacolor pencil. It's the Prismacolor Verithin, Verithin. So it's not a super soft pencil. It's not like a 3B level of softness graphite. It's a little bit harder. But I liked the color, and it picked it up. And I do find that working with fresh leaf works best. And sometimes it works best, of course, to flip the leaf over and work on the side that has the most prominent veins. And sometimes I do that, depending on what I want to show.
I had a question for you, Kate. Have you ever tried, like, I've seen like special journals for writing in the rain that are supposed to be like, you know, useful in the field if it might get wet if it's raining. Have you ever had any experience with those?
I actually haven't. I've seen other people use them, but I haven't used them myself. And I'm not sure. Let's see, I just saw somebody make a comment about how they only work with pencil. That may be the case. So I can't really give you any advice on what media to use, but I suspect it would be a more limited range of media.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Chris.
Kate, this is Claire. Have you ever worked with both drawing and, say, you know, for those of us who are lacking in some of the drawing skills, combine it with something like photography or you know, or any other means? Have you done any pages like that, or do you see people do that, or do you think it's just not enough observation? Can you comment on that?
Happy to comment on it, Claire. I haven't done it myself, although I certainly take a million photos to remind myself of things that I want to journal about. The particular workshops that I have done have emphasized creating images by hand. But I think that there's no reason not to use photography and to even use it almost as a means of doing collage. I think that anything that gets you to look closely, and you know, photography can be an art and a science, and so I think there's nothing wrong with it. I think the point is to get out there and to try different ways of recording your observations. And I would say, you know, there are no rules.
Okay, thank you.
Did you answer Anna's question of, do you do pressed flowers or leaves?
Oh, I am not connected, so I can't see any of the questions.
Okay.
Anymore.
I wasn't sure if we did that one yet.
So I'm sorry, what was the question?
Anna was wondering if you do any pressed flowers or leaves.
I have done that with leaves, and in fact, the page that is the exercise that I was suggesting people do, called Turning Over and Over a New Leaf, that was actually one of my journal pages from a couple of years ago, where I did press these two leaves, and my exercise was trying to work with colored pencils to see if I could emulate the color of those leaves, and the leaves are still that color. So I think that can be very useful. I think a lot of people in journals will appropriately gathered samples, which everyone in this audience, you know, would know what that means. There's nothing wrong with including those too, and adding some verisimilitude, I guess you could say, to your journal. No reason not to.
That's great. And there was also a comment from Karen Wilhelm that the Cornell lab has an excellent course on nature journaling. I didn't know that, but I am taking a birding course with them now, and it's really well done. And do you have any pointers for non-artists? You know, as mentioned, drawing can be intimidating. Encourage folks to get something on paper. Like, where do you start?
Okay, well, definitely one place to start is with your attitude and your mindset when you're starting, which is to remember that you are drawing to learn about your subject. You are not there to make a perfect, pretty planet portrait, for example. And I will say that there are some very useful instructions and a sequence for drawing. I'll point back to Jack's book, the one that I showed in two different slides. There is a wonderful sequence that you can use to approach almost any subject. And what it's really about is getting some basic shapes down first. And that non-photo blue pencil is really great for that because it's not intimidating. You can make a lot of light, loose lines, and then you can go into it with pencil. I would say for someone who really hasn't drawn at all and who feels that it's daunting, go out and get your leaf and use some of the shortcuts that I mentioned to get an image down. If you want to do a rubbing, or you could do a rubbing on half of your leaf and then do kind of a dot to dot. You could either trace the perimeter or do a dot to dot and then fill in the lines and essentially, look at your leaf and look at your rubbing and copy it. I think, my advice is there's great methodologies in Jack's book. And then if you approach it with I'm going to get started and I'm going to do a little bit of it, as many days of the week as you can. If you get in your pencil miles, pretty soon your images are going to start pleasing you. But if you just remember that the point isn't so much about the product, it's about what you're learning while you're looking and doing your drawing. Does that help?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I'm now stopped sharing, so everyone can see me holding the phone and say thank you to Kate.
I wish I could see you, but
I know.
Thanks, Kate.
Zoom hates me, and I hate it back.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. Here's Kate's on the phone.
Bye, Kate.
Thank you, Kate.
That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.